Welcome to the third episode of Things You Didn't Know About the Holocaust. I'm Phyllis Zimbler Miller, and I'm very excited today to have Jason Bell on the show to talk about his book, Cracking the Nazi Code, which we will explain to you what that means in a minute. He's a professor of philosophy at the University of New Brunswick in Canada. I had to think about that for a minute, and the author of the nonfiction book, Cracking the Nazi Code, the untold story of Agent 12 and the solving of the Holocaust Code. So welcome, Jason, and tell us the origin story of this book and then the fascinating research.
Sure. So I stumbled into this book. I was looking in Germany for relations between American pragmatism and German phenomenology. I thought there had to be some kind of missing link there because the movements are so similar to one another. So I went on
Hey,
a research.
you better explain to those of us what those words mean.
Sure. So pragmatism is America's notable philosophy. It focuses on the relation of thinking and acting. And then phenomenology pays attention to human intentions and how that frames our understanding of the world. So, German phenomenology was founded early 20th century by a Jewish philosopher in Germany named Edmund Husserl. Pragmatism was founded at Johns Hopkins University and Harvard, a couple of other places about the same time. So I went to Germany to see what kind of historical basis I could find for these relations, and that's when I found a doctoral dissertation uh, written by Winthrop Bell, completed in 1914, that explained pragmatism to the phenomenologists. So that was really the missing link. But the dissertation was missing several pages, and I found that Winthrop Bell's papers were housed at Mount Allison University in New Brunswick, Canada, but they were under restriction. And at that time, I had absolutely no idea why they were under restriction, but I wrote a letter to the university's president and asked for those restrictions to be lifted so that I could go in and do research. The restrictions were lifted. I later found that was after Mount Allison checked with Britain's Foreign Office and confirmed that these documents were no longer classified. So at that point, again, I still had no idea why there were restrictions or why they had been lifted. But I went in there, I found Winthrop Bell's philosophy materials, and then I had some time to keep looking around. And that's when I realized he was a British spy. And for a couple of years, I was really working on his philosophy. I did not look at his espionage documents, but when I finally did look at his espionage documents, this was, I believe, the year 2012. I saw that he had provided the earliest warnings against the Nazis. So at that point, 2012, I really began to alter my research trajectory so I could study the espionage documents and how that fit in with these warnings against the first the Nazis and then against the Holocaust.
Okay, let's just clarify. The thesis was written in 1914. He was at German University, right, at the time?
That's correct. So he finished the dissertation in 1914. He began in 1912. It was at the University of Göttingen in Germany, which was the hotbed of physics and mathematics. A lot of Nobel Prize winners had come out of there. Winthrop finished his dissertation just after World War I had broken out. So he had actually been arrested by the German authorities because he was a British subject. So he was in jail. His committee members went to the jail to conduct the oral defense of the dissertation in 1914.
Yeah, I read that in the book. I thought that was in your book. I thought that was fascinating. Now, what caused him to be so perceptive that he started warning about Nazism early on?
Well, the very earliest warning. So he knew towards the tail end of World War One that a group had seized the country in what amounted to a coup of military leaders who were virulent racists and anti-Semites. Bell knew this because he had friends who worked in the upper echelons of German military intelligence. So this was quite accidental on his part. I mentioned he had been at the University of Göttingen. It was a hotbed of math and physics. So he was friends with graduate students and young doctors who were teaching in that department. When World War I broke out, everybody was recruited into the military, including his friends. But quickly, the Germans realized that these people should not be on the front lines. They should be doing work in military intelligence. So several of his friends, including Lutherans and Jews, were recruited into military intelligence. They had a picture from the inside of what was going on. Uh, in the final years of the war, they were visiting him in his prison camp, which was near Berlin, and telling him these stories. So he really had a perfect picture of what was going on in Germany at a time when British and American authorities just did not know what the internal situation was like in the country.
Even in your book, I wanted to, anti-Semitism is, we know, a very old hatred, and it's always a convenient scapegoat. But I'd like you to talk about the letter in 1915 in a couple minutes, but I don't understand why already at that point, without Hitler, you know, why were they already such Jew haters in Germany, where it was considered an enlightened country and Jews were novelists and musicians? And where did this come from? Is it from the Prussia military? I mean, I just don't understand.
Well, it largely came from the head of a single psychopath, General Erich Ludendorff, who was officially the number two uh, in the German military, but in reality, he was the top figure. So the very top general was at that point kind of out of the loop. So Ludendorff subscribed to very strange fringe theories, and so anti-Semitism in Germany, like anti-Semitism in America and in Canada, in one sense, is always there, but it's typically during normal times a very fringe movement. But Ludendorff was very enmeshed in that fringe movement. He had strange theological ideas, so he was in. We don't know exactly when he turned to this, but he had a whole conception about Aryan Nordic gods who were in a battle against dark skinned gods, and that one or the other was going to win, and that the losers were going to be exterminated. So during World War One, Ludendorff was thinking about this both in relation to Slavic people, Russians, Poles, Ukrainians, etc., and also to the Jews. But this fringe racist network basically decided that they were going to need to conceal for a while their hatred of the Slavs because they were going to need to get the Slavs in a new alliance that would fight a new world war that would be able to defeat the Western powers. Then, of course, Ludendorff and his friends were planning on getting rid of the Slavs as well. So Jews became the scapegoats to stand for Ludendorff's hatred for a lot of groups. And of course, Ludendorff there was able to build upon a history of anti Semitism. But the advantage for Ludendorff was that there were not a whole lot of Jews. So even in Germany, they were a group that he could bully and pick on. Whereas he did not feel like in 1918, 1919, he could get away with picking on the Russians because there were so many of them.
Okay, let's just again roll back for a minute. So during World War One, the nominal leader of the Germans was the Kaiser, who had to abdicate. Is that the right word? And no, I want republic, which came in at the end of World War One. But Ludendorff was really, I think you're explaining about pulling the strings for the Kaiser. Now, was the Kaiser known to be anti-Semitic, or he was just kind of, I don't know, off, out of the picture?
I think he was really out of the picture. So he was interested in, building his own portfolio, being able to expand his territories. But history tells of him as something like a playboy. He wanted to be enjoying himself. He was really out of the loop. And what Winthrop Bell described in his first intelligence meetings late in 1918 is that General Ludendorff had, without permission, called into existence all kinds of governmental organizations that owed their allegiance and authority to him,
For
uh,
Ludendorff.
to Ludendorff. So this was going on without the Kaiser knowing about it. In particular, And then after the war ended, those organizations remained in many ways intact. So they kept on owing their loyalty to General Ludendorff. And so this group, Winthrop Bell was describing, is they'd lost. The Democratic government had signed an agreement saying that the war was over, but Lord Ludendorff and his group simply were going to refuse to accept that agreement. They were going to keep on fighting this war against the Jews secretly and seeing themselves as being the legitimate heirs of the German government and the Democrats as being as having illicitly taken over control.
Okay, just to make it clear for our listeners, when Jason says Democrats, Germany had not been a democracy. And now, he'll correct me if I'm wrong, through the Treaty of Versailles, a democracy was imposed. But they, and I say this as someone who lived in Germany. Uh, my husband and I were stationed in Munich with the American Army from September 70 to May 72. We saw the concepts of when they followed directions and when they didn't. So suddenly, without any training in democracy or any even real interest in democracy, they are told you have a democratic government.
Sure. I mean, there was a democratic parliament that existed beforehand, so they were operative during World War One, but they had very little power. So basically, they had the power to issue debt or refuse to issue debt. The German military was feeding them, the Democratic Parliament, the same propaganda they were feeding to everybody else, which had it that Germany was being attacked by Russians and the British to carve them up. So this was all a made up story. But the parliamentarians believed it for a number of years until some of the leftist groups began protesting. Then the centrists became involved. And basically, what happened is it became clear that Parliament was going to enact its one power, which was to refuse to issue more debt. And that's when the military effort fell apart, and Ludendorff decided to blame this on the Jews. What you get after World War One then is this group. So there again, there were the structures in place. Germans knew how to vote, etc. But this group that was basically able to do nothing other than to kind of play banker once every few years suddenly had the full responsibility for running the government under these extraordinary difficult conditions where they were bankrupt and people were starving. And there's this active war going on between the extremist on the left and the extremist on the right. The government did not have the forces, the manpower to be able to combat that.
And there's so much we could talk about, but I'm trying to see if the thing that really interested me also that I didn't understand is the militias. In other words, because the Treaty of Versailles limited the German army after World War One, and I've read, I don't think in your book somewhere else, I think that meant that they could pick the cream when the crop means they could pick the people the farthest to the right if they wanted. But why were all these militias? Who were they and why were they legal? I don't understand.
Well, so they were technically illegal, but they were being funded.
Wait, technically illegal, right?
They were technically illegal, but they were being funded by different groups for different reasons. So some money was coming in from Moscow to feed and clothe and arm the leftist communist militias. They were hoping to take over the country for communism. Some of the right-wing militias were being funded by the major landowners and by industrialists who wanted them to protect their property against this disarray because at that point the German government could not provide security. So those right-wing movements also happened to be largely run by anti-Semites, not all of them, but many of them were run by anti-Semites. And so, quite accidentally, some of these industrialists were funding these right wing militias just for protection, but were inadvertently funding these anti Semitic movements. So, these were about the only ways that these young men who had just gotten kicked out of the military because Versailles was demanding that the numbers decrease, this was about the only way that people could get jobs. And so, that became the only growth industry in Germany was to join one of these militias. Winthrop Bell in his intelligence reports was saying, we call these the communist or the reactionary right wing militias, but in reality, the soldiers didn't know who they were fighting for. They were just carrying a gun and pointing it to where their officers told them to point it. In reality, it was a very small group of ideologically motivated people who were calling the shots. And this was one of the ways in which the early rise of this Nazi movement was so invisible, was because virtually nobody in the broader public believed it or accepted it. It was a very small group of people who were virulently anti-Semitic, who were funding these movements on the right. But yet that group was accumulating more and more and more power, because the rest of Germany was bankrupt, and here was this group that was offering good jobs and a steady salary and purpose to these young men, and that let them put food on the table for their families, etc. And that was the core of what became the military structure support of the early nationalist socialist democratic movement under Adolf Hitler.
Very interesting. You're filling in some blanks for me because I know how devastated the soldiers were at World War I when they came back to nothing. So I didn't quite make the connection that okay, here's a job for you. Okay, I really, really want to go back to 1915 when that Jewish newspaper broke the story that you talk about in your book. So tell that story.
Sure. So there was a secret meeting in 1915, and it involved people who had been in people who were theoretically involved in anti-Semitism in this kind of fringe literary movement, along with senior figures in the government and the military who remained unnamed. And in my book, I say this had to have been General Ludendorff. There was nobody else in that position who could have had the authority to begin across the army to be pumping in anti-Semitic literature. So we know historically that happened, that Ludendorff was pumping anti-Semitic literature to the German military. But then we now know about this 1915 secret meeting that happened that declared that at the very day that the current hostilities ended, the very day that World War I ended, a new world war would begin targeting the Jews.
Okay, wait,
And so,
wait. I just, for those of you, so the war started in 1914, World War One. This is only a year later that this meeting is, but yet they were looking ahead to when the war ended. At that time, they didn't know exactly the date, but we will just remind everyone November 1918 was the armistice. Okay, go ahead. Just wanted to put it in context.
sure. So there's a Jewish newspaper in Frankfurt called the Jüdische Rundschau, the Jewish Review, in 1917 got notice of that meeting having happened. So this right wing movement was trying to raise money so that they would be able to put this attack against the Jews in place, and that's when the Jüdische Rundschau publicized it. A couple of months later, early in 1918, a similar note ran in a British newspaper. I believe it was in Manchester, commenting on this. And at this point, it just seemed really like funny to the British. That was the tone of the British article, that this was a really silly idea. But look at how desperate the Germans have become, that they would be thinking about attacking the Jews, etc. But the notion of this 1915 meeting was that there had to be, in order to win the war that they wanted to win, they wanted to be the ones controlling the world. They needed to get rid of the Jews to make that happen. And this was Ludendorff's pet idea. And as soon as the war ended and Winthrop Bell's on the scene as a British secret agent, he sees practically these events unfolding. So Jewish businesses being attacked across Germany, Jews being assaulted on the streets,
Wait,
etc.
we're talking, just let's clarify. We're not talking Kristallnacht in 1938. We're talking
We're
when?
talking, yeah, Kristallnacht, summer of 1919. So
Basically 19 years, whoever did the math,
that's
beforehand.
exactly right. That's exactly right. So systematic attacks on Jews. Everybody knows about Kristallnacht because at that point the world's eyes were on Germany. But in 1919, people were badly distracted. There was a lot of starvation, many wars going on in the world. And what happens is you have, and this is before Hitler is even involved in the movement, you have absolutely a template for what Hitler would later do, the systematic targeting of Jews throughout Germany, uh, along with a well designed, professional, well funded propaganda appearing throughout Germany, blaming all of the country's troubles on the Jews, and propaganda posters demanding genocide. So posters saying "kill the Jews."
Wait. In 19, in 1919, there were actual posters that said kill the Jews.
Yes. And Bell's agency, so Bell was working for MI6, the British Secret Intelligence Network. His cover job was as a Reuters reporter. Bell was getting these stories to the Western press. So reports of Jews being targeted throughout Germany, of this propaganda, etc. And yet, this was not front page news at the moment because there were all kinds of wars going on, all kinds of starvation going throughout the world. So it was just one of many things that was happening. People did not notice it, even though Bell was warning the public, and in his secret intelligence reports, in much more detail, he was explaining that this was deeply integrated into the German military structure at that point. So not the beginning of 1919, but towards the end of 1919, this group of Nazis had virtually seized control of the German military and were getting rid of, he said, of moderate officers at this point and collecting only themselves the most extremists in the positions of authority.
So, I don't know if your research extended to this, but what did the Jewish community in Germany say at that point? After all, many of them thought, they'd gotten they'd fought for Germany, they'd got Iron Crosses, I think that's the right word, uh, a military honor. So, did they pay any attention?
I didn't in the Jüdische Rundschau, so it wasn't in 1917 even front page news there. So it was
Fascinating.
a lower ranked story. Um, I don't think they saw, and they didn't know who the general was who was involved, was part of
Okay,
it. So
okay.
there was an unnamed general. They didn't know how high up it went. So the government, the Kaiser, the parliament, there was no tradition there of a virulent anti-Semitism. So I don't think people felt the need to be tremendously worried about it. And again, there wasn't a follow up. You didn't see a lot of news stories coming after this. It was really a once off. And then that period of violence that I spoke of in 1919, that was relatively compact in time as well. So I suggest in the book this was intentional, that these right wing German movements were funding actual Jew murders in other parts of Europe, including in Eastern Europe. Hundreds of thousands of Jews were being killed. But at home, they wanted things to be kept on the down low. They wanted to show their sponsors what they could do. And so there was a brief period
Mm.
in which these attacks were happening, very much again like Kristallnacht, where the businesses were broken up, and then Hitler promises to put a lid on it, and then things seem normalized for the Jews again afterwards. That was very much a template that was already created in 1919. So 1920, Jews were living normal lives again. It was just this brief period in 1919 when these attacks were happening. Again, these were attacks on Jewish-owned businesses throughout Germany. My suggestion in the book is the only way that could have happened was through people who had access to the secret files that would say what people's ethnicity were. That was the only way that you could conduct those coordinated attacks on Jews throughout Germany. In other words, German military intelligence had to have had a hand in it.
Wait, let's say that again. German military intelligence had to have a hand in providing addresses, etc., of Jewish-owned businesses.
Correct.
At that same time, the stab in the back myth became very popular, which I've read about in other books too. And okay, I'd like to share this and then you'll correct it. What I find interesting from a non-historian point of view is number one, the difference between World War II and World War II. that World War One in Germany, they didn't really have the kind of destruction that they had in World War Two. So in one of my research books that I read, I was shocked to find out that they thought the German people, believing the propaganda, thought they were winning in World War One.
Mhm.
And then suddenly there was an armistice. And that helped them believe the stab in the back that the Jews and the communists did them in, did Germany in.
Yep.
Do you want to talk a little bit about, and that persisted. But I mean, the Germans couldn't accept the responsibility. And I've heard Daniel Mendelsohn, the author of the many books, but I love his book, The Lost, Search for Six of the 6 Million, to say that really it's a second 30-year war in Europe from World War One through World War Two. Do you want to talk a little bit about that and how they just couldn't accept they lost? Germany had this military Prussian background, and they just, Tacitus spoke about how warrior-like the Germans were. And how many hundreds of years ago was that? Thousands?
That's right, and so the story really is Germany was had been a lot of different independent nations with many different characters. The Prussians had defined themselves through the centuries of warfare against the Slavic East, and so that was their primary enemies. And then in the late 1800s, the Prussians, through a combination of politics and military force, take over the rest of Germany. So Winthrop Bell was educated in a part of Germany that had been managed under the British Crown called Niedersachsen. And so it was very liberal British style in its leanings. This is where Winthrop Bell's friends were coming from during World War II. Many of them were anti-Nazis who did very damaging work to Hitler, or against Hitler, I should say, on behalf of the Western Alliance, because they were never seduced by that Prussian military mindset. They were horrified when they first met it. Um, so really, so what had happened? So in a way, the devastation of World War II didn't strike during World War I in the same way, but it did strike, and that was because of the blockade, the British blockade of the ports that was on. So hundreds of thousands of Germans starved to death. The people who did not starve to death many of them were having terrible health problems as a result of this. And so when this militarist government collapsed, it collapsed really horribly. And at this point, Winthrop Bell was there at the beginning stages. He said this revulsion against the German militarist class was universal. So late 1918, nobody was blaming the Allies. Everybody was blaming the German militarists.
You mean the
Uh,
Germans were blaming the German militaries?
that's right. That's exactly right. So the German population at this point desperately wanted democracy. They wanted friendship with the West, etc. The only group that wanted to keep up the war was the small group of militarists. They realized that they needed to change public perception. And so Winthrop Bell said they started a policy of calling people's attention to what economic conditions in Germany had like before World War One. They didn't want people to think of 1915, 1916 when people were starving to death. They wanted to get people thinking about 1913. Um, and then, right, they wanted to blame the Jews for their military failures. In fact, it was pure German military failure. They didn't take Paris on the timeline that they had hoped, and General Ludendorff and the other architects of this failure did not want to blame themselves. They wanted to blame somebody else, and so they said it was the Jews who were responsible for this. And I think to what measure this was a scare quote cold rational calculation versus how much of this was people like Ludendorff believing some really strange theological notions about the Aryan gods, etc. It's hard to parse out. Of course, Ludendorff is not putting a lot of this in writing. This is happening by word of mouth. But it's clear that there's a very deliberate attempt from 1915 forwards to blame everything on the Jews, because Ludendorff, who's a clever military man, knows at this point that Germany cannot win World War I because their enemies have far more manpower and far more industrial capability. So the idea is to keep holding the line on the battlefield while setting up this future reality in which German democracy, which is seen as having Jewish and Slavic influences,
Hmm.
will be destroyed, and the German military class will run everything. And as I show in the book, this is all in place before Adolf Hitler is recruited into the movement. So Hitler is recruited into a well-organized plot that already exist at the highest levels of the military. Not everybody is convinced by this, but enough of them are, including Ludendorff. Ludendorff then becomes Hitler's early sponsor, helps Hitler advance through the ranks. But fundamentally, what Hitler had going for him in terms of his ability to be a popular political figure was that he was not a German officer. And so Winthrop Bell in 1919 is saying that the German populace just detests, loathes, hates this German militarist officer population, but Hitler had only been a corporal and, in
Ah.
fact, had avoided being promoted, possibly because he knew that if he was promoted, he would have become one of the hated members of the officers' class. By staying this junior enlisted member, he was the one who was able to take the reins. All the while, I think these officers thought that they were controlling him and that he would keep on doing their bidding, which of course turns out not to be the case. But I think this is one of the reasons why the Allies were not particularly keen to assassinate Hitler, because they knew that there were a lot of other people, who were generals in the German military who were also glad to kill Jews. Killing Hitler would not have solved the problem.
Very interesting. That's really interesting, especially about I didn't understand the th about the by staying a corporal, he was not part of that officer class. Now we have a little bit more time left, and we could talk for hours. What do you think you'd like the listeners to come away from most, and what Winthrop Bell just well, I think they should read your book because it's fascinating, but and I'll put a information description to this recording, but in terms of understanding how political movements that we don't pay attention to, and I don't mean necessarily talk about today, but just what are the signs that you think from what you learn we need to be paying attention to?
Well, I think one thing that we should pay attention to is thinking that coordinated attacks on the Jews happening at the same time in different places, that this may have an underlying motive. And in recent years, we've taken to laughing at the idea of conspiracy theories, but the Jews have throughout history been the target of real live conspiracies. And historically, these have been emotional local movements that turned into slaughters of Jews in single cities, but these have also been national and transnational movements funded by people who want to protect their own interests, deflecting attention away from themselves towards the Jews. So I think we should be, paranoid might be the wrong word, but continually attentive, even when times are seem normal about the way that hatred is organized against Jews. And then I think we should become very, very nervous under the conditions we've seen over the last couple of years, where we've seen organized physical attacks against Jews happening in different places at once, and look to see who can be benefiting from this. But then I think the second lesson is what Winthrop Bell understood is that so long as that can be contained to those small groups that can profit from this, the danger is really not so great. The real danger happens when poorer people and younger people are propagandized and recruited into the movements. So I think we need to be paying continual attention to how these extremists know that they need to recruit young people into their movements in order to gain strength, and make sure that doesn't happen. And that was Winthrop Bell's advice to the British government in 1919, was that these youth groups needed to be broken up. This is where this training in anti-Semitism was happening. And opportunities needed to be provided to these young men so they could be doing more productive things. And I think what's happening right now is similar. There's economic distress in the world. There's a small group of people profiting from this. Incredibly, there's a lot of other people suffering. And I think I'm not blaming certainly here all billionaires, but there's going to be a smaller group of racist billionaires who do not want their own property being touched, and they would prefer to redirect public animosity towards Jewish people. It's an ancient impulse, and it's gained, unfortunately, a lot of energy recently. And I think, I mean, another lesson is that, I think Jewish people have historically been concerned about protecting themselves, which they ought to be. But I think there's also a key notion here that the violence against Jews is not going to end with the Jews. And Jews can be finding solidarity by showing that protection of Jewish interests is also protection against protection of their own interests is also protection of everybody's interests. So Jewish self protection here is protecting America and Canada and world democracy. And in the same voice, I should say that people here should think that attacks on Jews are attacks on themselves, and should be doing a lot more to combat anti-Jewish violence. And I think right now, unfortunately, we're seeing some of the parallels with 1919, in that attacks on Jews are not being taken as seriously outside of Jewish communities as they should be being taken. And I would, if I, control the levers of power, I would suggest there should be secret policemen walking around in the most Jewish outfits imaginable, so that when they're attacked, the people who attack them can be promptly arrested. Would be one of my suggestions. But why? Because these attacks are not going to end on the Jews. They're going to continue to rob and kill other people as well.
Uh, I, I, I think amen is the wrong thing, but that is my own personal, strongly held belief that people must realize that the attacks on the Jews are attacks on all democracy, which is okay. I don't want to get too upset at the end of this interview, but that's what I wish people would realize, that really it's an attack on democracy and our way of life. And they have to pay attention sooner than later. With with those sobering words, I thank you, Dr. Jason, so much. I really appreciate this. Appreciate our listeners. I would just like to say, in memory of all the victims and saviors and people like Dr. Withram Bell, no relation, who did early warnings, may their memories be a blessing forever.